I am always watching out for how the climate action is going, especially in the global north, because they have been historically responsible for almost all of the emissions and climate change, and they are, divided. So Europe seems much more progressive on wanting to do something about climate change, whereas US is not so great in terms of just agreeing on climate change. Australia and Canada also kind of not very great on climate action. But once in a while you get these examples which tell you how difficult the problem is, especially because the global north also keeps advocating to the global south that they must get on board and do as much as possible for climate action, which many countries are trying, and they're all signatories to the Paris Agreement and so on. So this headline, just as I'm recording this on August 21st, this is the article from August 6th, so very recent. Europe blinks in its commitment to a great green transition. So I have mentioned several times in other podcasts about how the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the gas supply perturbations, kind of forced Europeans to start thinking about burning coal again, importing gas from Norway and US, and calling gas as a low emission fossil fuel, which is tricky because you are expecting the global south to reduce their emissions by going off of fossil fuels, moving to renewables, and now you are calling gas as low emission fossil fuel. This is a bit of a fancy wordplay there. Nonetheless, Europe made big bold promises to slash carbon emissions to slow global warming, but now the bill is coming due and governments are starting to blink at the cost, political and economic, needed to power the great transition away from fossil fuels and toward renewables. Okay, once far off goals are getting more real as Europe wrestles with how to tell Germans which cars they can drive, Italians which stoves are acceptable, Polish miners why they must abandon coal, and Britons why they can't keep exploring their country's massive oil and gas reserves. And just a few days after this article, the Prime Minister of the UK, Rishi Sunak, went and I think opened new drilling permissions in the North Sea. So there have been protests against those and so on. So this is a very difficult issue of actually making the transition, and I'm putting it in adaptation because we keep talking about incremental adaptation versus transformational adaptation. So these are incremental and yet they are very difficult. So transformational is just a dream concept at this point. But we should also remember decarbonization as a paradigm will work very differently than all these emissions reductions and the various options of keeping coal in the ground or keeping fossil fuel in the ground, worrying about which stove in which car and so on and so forth. So I will add to this opening a little bit more on what to do with emissions reductions and how that will combine with geoengineering, which is now being mentioned as inevitable as a part of the solutions we need to accomplish in terms of the global warming targets of 1.5 degrees C, which pretty much seems impossible at this point, or 2 degrees C, which may be still achievable, but it relies on many technological promises of carbon capture and bioenergy and so on. Therein lies another key question. Is carbon removal delaying emission reductions? This is a very key question because if oil companies, for example, keep pushing carbon capture and sequestration as a very viable solution, which indirectly also implies that we can keep burning fossil fuels or keep delaying emissions reductions and mitigation efforts because carbon capture will begin to take care of the problem as well. So this is discussed in this review paper in the context of whether carbon capture begins to create a moral hazard or a mitigation deterrence. Mitigation deterrence is kind of a moral hazard, but not exactly the same, as we will see here. Carbon dioxide removal is rapidly becoming a key focus in climate research and politics. This is raising concerns of moral hazard or mitigation deterrence, that is, the risk that promises of and or efforts to pursue carbon removal end up reducing or delaying near-term mitigation efforts. Moral hazard, you may already know what it means. It's an economic concept where some person or some business has some protection from risk, like an insurance, for example, which then incentivizes the person to take more risks, or the company to expose itself to more risks, because the individual or the company doesn't bear the full cost of the risk if it comes to materialize. So if you lose your house, then you get paid back because insurance, it's insured. So you will go end up living near the coast where you shouldn't be living, or in a floodplain, and so on and so forth. So that's moral hazard. Mitigation deterrence is slightly different, as we'll see in a minute. Some, however, contest this risk, arguing that it's overstated or lacking evidence. In this review, we explore the reasons behind the disagreement in the literature itself. We unpack the different ways in which moral hazard or mitigation deterrence, MHMD as they refer to, is conceptualized, and examine how these conceptualizations inform assessments of MHMD risks. We find that MHMD is a commonly recognized feature of modeled mitigation pathways using the integrated assessment models that we've discussed elsewhere, but that conclusions as to the real-world existence of MHMD the conclusions as to the real-world existence of MHMD diverge on individualistic versus structural approaches to examining it. So people may publish their results and say, we have looked at MHMD and it doesn't have any consequences in terms of MHMD. But does that somehow have a structured approach that everybody can understand and follow? Individualistic approaches favor narrow conceptualizations of MHMD, which tend to exclude the wider political economic context in which carbon removal emerges. So if you just use an IAM and the pathways and BECCS and renewables and energy transitions and carbon capture and sequestration and come to conclusions and say this doesn't have any moral hazard or mitigation deterrence impacts, then has it really considered the wider political economic context in which these pathways will actually occur? And the European example is a good one, where they did start wanting to meet their goals on mitigation, but now they are saying, oops, this is not what we had in mind in terms of political or economic costs. This exclusion limits the value and relevance of such approaches. We argue for a broader understanding of what counts as evidence of delaying practices and propose a research agenda that complements theoretical accounts of MHMD with empirical studies of the political economic structures that may drive mitigation deterrence dynamics. So I've already mentioned how the socio-technical transitions cannot be done in isolation with worrying just about economic and technical feasibilities, but they must consider the context, the socio-political outcomes or barriers, and so on and so forth. So this paper basically does a review of articles and looks at number of articles here per year going from 2011 to 2021 on the corpus of articles. They excluded 2022 because of incomplete data and so on. So basically they are looking at papers that did mitigation, carbon capture, etc., and whether they considered MHMD in a structural way or a individualistic take on how that works. So let's read a couple of more points from the paper and then just jump to conclusion. I'm not going to read the whole paper. It's a very detailed analysis. You should read it if this topic is of interest. I wanted to raise it as something we must consider when we talk about mitigation, carbon capture especially. Substituting carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management for other forms of mitigation was controversial. This idea actually of solar radiation management emerged in the 1960s, and policy implications or policy considerations were already done at that point. Nordhaus co-authored an important 1992 U.S. National Academy of Sciences report about climate policy, which discussed several geoengineering options. This book discusses the history of geoengineering. While industry representatives on The author panel, including Robert Frosch from the car manufacturer General Motors, advocated geoengineering as a way of avoiding the cost of emissions reductions. Some scientists were less convinced. Many report contributors were worried that even the thought that we could offset some aspects of inadvertent climate modification by deliberate modification schemes could be used as an excuse by those who would be negatively affected by controls on the human appetite to continue polluting and using the atmosphere as a free sewer. Basically, they are saying oil companies and industries like car manufacturers, especially the internal combustion engines, which is still playing out, would like to delay emissions reductions, fuel efficiency standards, and so on, because market forces allow them to keep the car prices cheaper, and the infrastructure investment is already there, so they can continue to churn out these cars in large numbers as well. This may have been the first mention of MHMD problem in academic literature, as pointed out by this paper. A few years later, Keith gave the problem a name, adopting a term from the insurance sphere, moral hazard. Okay, so is it the same? The concept of mitigation deterrence takes a step away from the original moral hazard concept in that it focuses on the process of substitution itself. Marcuson et al. Define MD as the prospect of reduced or delayed mitigation resulting from the introduction or consideration of another climate intervention like carbon capture and sequestration. This definition departs from the moral hazard framing in at least two ways. First, it does not necessarily see deterrence as the result of intentional decision making. So as we mentioned in moral hazard, there are players, agents who are making a decision based on the risk payout they would face to expose themselves to more risks based on the protection they have. So insurance gives them the incentive to actually expose themselves to more risks, even though it's meant to just protect them against unintended risks. So there is intentional decision made there. First, it does not necessarily see deterrence as the result of intentional decision making, but it's a byproduct. MD can actually be an emergent effect, that is the unforeseen and even unacknowledged result of disparate decisions taken for different reasons by any number of people, or indeed as the result of a particular political economic regime. This broader framing allows for a wider set of possible substitution mechanisms than those proposed by principal-agent theory. Okay, so it's a difference, but here we are only worried about whether CCS in fact ends up delaying the mitigation. This conceptual plurality in terms of how the moral hazard and mitigation deterrence are seen by different groups is illustrative of the subjective and ultimately political nature of the debate. This is the key part we have to realize, because most climate scientists keep talking in the technical sphere, but the sociopolitics of it is very key in terms of the nature of the debate. The position any one person takes on MHMD ultimately hinges on how they assess the risks, costs, benefits, and likelihood of future carbon removal relative to near-term emission reductions. Such assessment will, at least in part, reflect the values, interests, and worldviews of that person. In the next section, we discuss how the political nature of this debate plays out in the academic literature by exploring the epistemological assumptions underlying claims about the evidence base for MHMD, which obviously I'm not going to read that section. Just jumping to what the review suggests in terms of advancing the debate on moral hazard and mitigation deterrence effects of geoengineering in general. In this review, we have identified and discussed three common approaches to MHMD in the scientific literature and analyzed how these relate to conceptual and methodological diversity and the way evidence for delay or deterrence is understood. So they're trying to give it a structural framework for assessing the MHMD dimension of future pathways, essentially, let's say using IAMs, which themselves have faced lots of criticism for, trying to fit the 2 degrees C or 1.5 degrees C targets into this. And trying to make it a reality, because those targets actually came from Bill Nordhaus, the 2 degrees C, or the political agenda of the worries by the alliance of small state and developing states. We find first that scholars tend to agree that there are significant MHMD effects in IAM scenarios. IAMs are integrated assessment models used for developing future pathways for driving the assessment reports. So the scholars tend to agree that there are significant MHMD effects in IAM scenarios, even if they disagree on whether that has any bearing on the real world, despite literature discussing the performativity of climate model output. Second, we find that research based on individualist conceptualizations and methodologies tend to be most skeptical of MHMD concerns, with various studies suggesting there is no evidence for MHMD or even indications of the opposite effect. These studies build on an epistemology where proof for or against delay or deterrence is derived from individual actors' preference statements, perceptions, choices, and actions. Epistemology is basically the generation of knowledge in these papers. Because studies do not show a consistent tendency towards MHMD among participants, the empirical basis for MHMD is then questioned. We argue that the limitations of this approach in terms of interpretations of results and real-world relevance means that the ambiguity of the evidence in these studies does not constitute evidence that MHMD is absent. So what is the precautionary principle? Do we keep going assuming there is no MHMD, or do we have to really address it? Thirdly, we suggest that structural accounts, among others drawing on political economy, provide us with the tools necessary to understand whether and how substitution is playing out across various social and political contexts, as for instance in net zero pledges. Generally speaking, such accounts rely on two modes of analysis. The first explores theoretically how political and economic systems operate, what dynamics and power relations exist within them, what kind of functions CDR or carbon dioxide removal performs within these, and therefore whether MHMD risks seem likely. Our review shows that structural accounts of MHMD predominantly take this theoretical approach and find an abundance of reasons for why substitution between carbon removal and emission reduction is an exceedingly likely prospect, and why that would entail risks and undesirable social and environmental effects. The second mode of structural analysis draws more on empirical methods. There are so far few studies of this kind. So basically the overwhelming evidence suggests that there is in fact a moral hazard or mitigation deterrence effect of carbon removal or emissions reductions as options rather than going together and hitting on early emissions reductions, which obviously is not happening because as of now the curve on emissions is not bending at all. Finally, while theorization remains crucially important, the time is ripe for complement it with empirical understandings of the rapidly developing political and economic realities of MHMD across different geographical and temporal settings. In the current climate policy environment, with the rapid proliferation of ambiguous net zero pledges, especially among corporations as well, where verification, monitoring, and transparency is pointing to a lot of greenwashing, and the emergence of numerous CDR policy initiatives, such research is not only important but critical to prevent widespread mitigation deterrents. So we are pushing very hard on technological promises that are not yet yielding scalable results, and in the meantime those are serving to advocate delay in emissions reductions because it is seen as hurting economies in firms individuals' profits, and so on and so forth. So obviously, very complicated issue, and we cannot simply ignore it. Okay? See you in the next podcast.